Parents have been asked to do a lot this year with their families. I know that when I was teaching kids, I would always get families being so grateful that they could just drop their kids off and let them have their own time. But how has COVID really changed the impact of family roles?
I think one of the most common things that I've seen, and parents, this is not me throwing a jab at you at all. I think we were just trying to make it through the best way that we could. I've seen if there's an older child, they've taken on a lot of parenting roles.
Oh, okay.
Because mom or dad need to get all of their work done, and I think there's been fluctuations, right, between what kind of work we're looking for, how the amount of work that we're trying to put in, because I think everyone wanted to prove, like, okay, we're working from home, we're still being productive, like, I need to keep my job, especially in the beginning. But that meant, okay, all of our kids are at school now. School is the living room table, and they have, some of them are just watching videos. They're not in a live classroom. And so then how are they figuring this out? How am I making sure that they're paying attention while I'm in this Zoom meeting? And so the older kids, that kind of becomes their role, or had become their role. I know some of my teenage students were like, oh yeah, like I was like making breakfast and lunch for my younger siblings. I was the one who was making sure that they were there for their assessments. I was the one making sure that they were engaged. And then after that, like, then I had to go do all of my work. So, I mean, that puts a lot of strain on sibling relationships. But again, like, there's only so much that parents can do. You can't do 4 different things at once.
Right. So the shift, the family rolling is, if there is an older child, they're becoming more of a parent role, so that the parent can continue to work if they're working from home or maybe not at home. That's definitely. I guess it's a blessing and a curse too, because at least there's more people to help. But then that brother or sister relationship has kind of changed, right?
Right. It definitely is the way to make ends meet, right? Like, there's only so much that a parent can do. You have to get so many things done. The older child steps in, like, that makes everything work. However, for that child, it's, okay, now I have a really different relationship with my little brother or sister. One of the things that I've heard is, like, mom and dad aren't paying attention to me, but they're expecting so much of me. Like, how am I supposed to do all of this? So that feeling that mom and dad are having is now translating into that teenager, usually unbeknownst to the parent, because then the teenager's like, well, I see that mom and dad are doing all of these things, but I don't want to stress them out by telling them this. So it's finding that balance of also being able to give each of your kids some of that, like, one-on-one time, or at least acknowledging what they're doing. And I mean, I don't know if you have siblings. I was the oldest, but I know that I would try to boss my younger brother around, and still to this day, he'll, like, bring that up. And this was outside of COVID. And he would tell me when I was younger, like, you're not my mom. And, like, that was definitely an area of contention.
Yeah.
And so me knowing that outside, like, from my personal life, right? If I were to try to think about what we would have been like during the pandemic, granted, my brother and I are not not the best example of what that could have looked like, but I know that there is a ton of contention, a lot of conflicting feelings. You want to help your parents, but you also don't want to change that relationship with your siblings.
Right. So within this year, how has the typical development stages of children been impacted or interrupted with all of this?
So I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier with the social skills development, right? Like, we learn so much from our peers. We learn so much from interacting with other people. Granted, I'm hoping that parents are interacting with their kids at home so they're not losing all interaction, but you're really missing that. My school has been back in person since August, so that, for my students, that was a really thankful thing. But even still, from being out of school from last March until August, I had children lose so many social skills where they didn't know how to, manage a conflict with someone else. They didn't know how to start a conversation. also the way that my school is run, like they can't really have a lot of like interaction during recess. They have like dots that they have to stand on. They can't move around, but they are still able to like talk to each other, which, I mean, now, right, we're in April, they've been able to regain some of that, but we saw a lot of steps back socially. And that's even for the high schoolers too, right? Like you get so used to interacting just on video games or Discord or through text message. Like I was having to encourage my kids to FaceTime, and they were like, "Miss Musk, like you're insane. No one makes phone calls anymore." And I was like, "But you need to do it." And then they would come back and be like, "Oh, you know what? Like I did feel more connected." So even though I was old school and crazy, right? It worked, but yeah, socially I think is the biggest thing developmentally where I just saw such huge setbacks. And some kids just like afraid to not be with mom and dad, and like.
And that's been developed within this year?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you think about that in terms of development, like that's a really young thing, like 2, 3 maybe, and I have school age kids like that right now because again, like anxiety is so much higher. Mom and dad are safe.
Yeah, and especially if they hear so much about the outside being so scary, that will definitely build up a little bit more.
To add on to it, if you think about adolescence too, like when you're a teenager, you want to get as far away from your parents as possible, right? This is when you really start to find yourself, your identity, like you get to gain some independence, hopefully not complete independence, but some independence. And this year, none of that's really been able to happen. So we're seeing some like lags in that. I have a lot of my teens really getting very frustrated about being at home. But it's been interesting. Initially they were really like pushing back against mom and dad, and then now it's kind of like settled in. A lot of them don't know kind of who they are though, because they haven't been able to have that really important like friend time or relationships that I know that a lot of parents are like, oh my gosh, I don't want to think about my teenager dating. I remember what we did as teenagers. But if you also think about like how important that was to your sense of self and like figuring out your world and your social world, and just not having any access to that and having to be with your parents 24/7 at 14, 15, 16, 17. Don't get me wrong, I love my parents, but there's no way that I would have ever wanted that.
Yeah.
Like that would have been so challenging.
And so, and then also with a normal school year too, is like the cliques, you know, the different groups of people that you, as you get into preteen to teen, you get to kind of float around and see what you fit. And that's not, you're saying that's not happening.
This is maybe not the best analogy, but if you think about like starting a romantic relationship with someone, you want that in person, right? Like you don't want to start a romantic relationship with someone who's halfway across the world and you can never see, right? You only talk online because there's so much of that relationship that's missing. Granted, for those of you who have started relationships that way, that's not a dig. It's just, I think if we could change it, this is like we would prefer it in person.
Yeah. Physical or in-person piece is definitely more ideal with that. And I think is it harder for teenagers to have that connection with different people online rather than in person, like to get into another group of?
I think if you were trying to change friend groups right now, this is a guess, I don't have any evidence for it, because I feel like people have really like hunkered down in the groups that they're in. I think that would be very, very challenging, right? I mean, teenagers meet people and friends online. Right. Quite often, I put that in quotes because you never really know who's on the other end. And I tend to be the most cautious person in the world. But it's not the same, right? Like, first off, you have to have all their information, and then to start, you're not as honest online either, right? That's like true. You only put your best foot forward if you're putting your best self out there versus the person that you want to be or that you hope to be. So if you're finding those relationships, teenagers online right now, they tend to be much more superficial. They're not as honest, they're not as deep, they're not as meaningful. And if your teenager is saying that they're so meaningful and it's everything, there's usually something deeper going on that therapy can help with. At least that's my experience. Because you're taking this huge amount of emotion and putting it onto someone that you've never met.